yes, that is new music. This is still Talk Junkie, and I am still Justin Perkins. That's special music. I made that on GarageBand, especially for episodes themed more like this. It seemed fitting. Um, the 80s were awesome, and that's pretty apparent. I came from the 80s, so apparently the 80s had to be somewhat awesome. Nostalgia is a weird thing. In so many aspects and in so many ways, we're constantly looking towards the future, especially as children. When I was a kid, all I wanted to do was get older. All I wanted to do was to grow up. And I really, really concentrated heavily on that. As I became a teenager, of course. Um, I'm not going to talk about being a teenager because that was in the 90s, and that's a different podcast all on its own. But in the 80s, I was a young kid. I was born in 82. So by 88, I'm 6 years old. So by 92, I'm 10. So we're going to look at 82 to 92. I'm going to throw 92 in there on the 80s. There's so much, even though I was very young in the 80s and really didn't experience a lot of that. I may have experienced it firsthand, but didn't have the ability to really recollect all of it firsthand. So a lot of my love for the 80s came later on. Now, anybody that knows me, and I'm sure there's probably some people listening that don't know me that well. Maybe I've got to the point where I have a lot of listeners by the time you listen to this, and nobody knows me at all. But anybody that knows me knows I started out kind of with a classic rock thing, but I'm very much a metal person, or at least a hard rock person at the lightest, probably. But even though 90s and 2000s pop, anything from the teens, I despise. I think it's fairly horrid. But 80's pop music is different. I enjoy 80's pop music. I don't like horror films. I'm just not a gross, gory type of person. Some 80's horror films is an exception. I love 80's cartoons, 80's toys, 80's wrestling, 80's movies. There's this sense of nostalgia there for me. And as hard as we look to move forward in our life, and as hard as we want as children to grow up, or as much as we want to see things advance and change, many, many, many of us look back to our childhood with a great fondness for all aspects of society in that time. Now, to go back now without the ability to podcast, or to go back now without social media, or to go back now without being able to contact my wife or kids via iPad or phone anytime I want to make sure that they're okay. You know, to be able to stay into contact with my parents and my family without having to be there with them all the time. To go back to the only phone you own is a house phone with a 10-foot curly cord that you drag through the house so that you can talk to someone all night on the phone, a young lady, if you will. That even continued into the 90s. But this nostalgia for something, for a life that really was a lot less comfortable than today's life in some aspects, but a lot greater if the 80s were your childhood. And even though it's the earlier part of my childhood and the first part of my childhood, it's always been very significant. The 80s and the late 90s, very, very big for me. Becoming important parts of my life. The thing about the 80s is excess, and everything was done with excess. And maybe that's why loving it is that way. It seems like people like myself who love the 80s love it in excess for whatever reason. The music, the fashion, okay, you know. I'm not big on I never was big on fashion, especially not back then, but I'm not big on fashion now, or 80s fashion for that matter. In all honesty, I'm only big on the music for maybe more of a nostalgia reason. Other than I do believe that movie soundtracks were really good as far as pop music went, but probably more so because they give me a feeling of that time. And a lot of the things that I love from the late 70s and the early 80s, I experienced later on in life. Three of my favorite comedy movies, not my top three or in any order or anything, but three of my favorite comedy movies are Fletch Lives, and Caddyshack. I could not have watched these movies really when they came out, but they're synonymous with the 80s and early 80s, and they appeal to me greatly because I look back and there is this, I don't know, almost this lust I have to still experience the 80s, to be able to experience the 80s as a teenager or a young adult, to be able to experience the 80s with my kids, because in a way, being that I was born in 82 and was very young to the 80s, I almost feel like I was gypped out of part of the 80s, the hanging out at the mall or in front of a local business, and being very sociable, and all these things really appeal to me. The birth of MTV. Children, before, in the early days of MTV stood for music television, and they actually had on MTV music videos. That was the birth of music videos. That was when Video Killed the Radio Star um, was on MTV. And even as a young kid, like, I remember those Peter Gabriel videos, and I remember, the VJs, and it just seemed like a sense of excitement. It seemed like a party, and even as a young kid, I was very drawn to that. And, I got into action movies at a very young age. I'm a huge Rambo fan. I'm a huge American Ninja fan, and that is a phenomenon that the kids today can't understand. The ninja movie and the ninja culture from the 80s is a huge, huge thing. It is something that really was the subculture in and of itself. I remember, looking in magazines and being able to find and purchase ninja costumes, throwing stars, the full suit, the little shoes they wore, to buy weapons. It was legal to buy weapons pretty much in most states, I think, at that time. We had flea markets in our area, and you could go there and you could buy all these different ninja weapons and all these ninja suits and stuff. And if you went to our local festivals, you could buy throwing stars and all this, and the ninja subculture was huge, and I believed myself, apparently, I found out later on this wasn't true, but I believed myself at the time to very much be a ninja, and practiced it quite extensively. But the movie culture was so different to me in the 80s, no matter what it was. The military based movies, and the ninja subculture, the B movies, the horrible B movies, these horrible comedies and horror movies made direct to release on VHS, because this is the really the rise of VHS and home movie watching. Although I can't give you an exact date, it definitely, if it was 80s, it was late 80s that I actually got a VCR of my own. We actually had to rent a VCR to watch movies when I was younger, but I'd have to go back and look. I do want to say, though, it was probably closer to late 80s, early 90s before I actually got a VCR. But Indiana Jones and the commercials for toys, the commercials for restaurants, the participation between restaurants and promotion, and that led up into the early 90s. The promotion for Addams Family and the promotion for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Pizza Hut was kind of involved with everything. What a Pizza Hut looked like in the 80s. Arcades are from the 80s. You see, I can go on tangent after tangent on why the 80s are unbelievably awesome. But then you have to sit and think, why would someone like myself, someone with some knowledge of the decade of the 80s, and some knowledge of the 90s, and some knowledge, pretty extensive knowledge of the 90s, pretty extensive knowledge of the 2000s and of the teens, and I look at where we are, and I look at the advancements we made, and I look at all of the amazing things that are afforded to me by living in this time, and why is it I look back on the 80s with such glee and just awe at times, and why do I feel this desire and this draw to that? And I've had to think about that quite a bit. It's dangerous to be too nostalgic. It's dangerous to always want to go back. If you always want to go back, you can never move forward. And not moving forward is a horrible, horrible way to live life. But to have nostalgia in the way of loving something and appreciating your time somewhere or in a certain place at a certain time is okay. And it's a part of being human. It's a part of memory. It's a part of building a person is with those memories. And I look at how popular the 80s are. I don't know if people born in the 70s had the same nostalgia and reacted this way. I could see it being that way. I do know that people who grew up in the 50s seem to have this. Because I hear it a lot from, I know everybody is drawn to when they grew up. They have a sense of emotion attached with that, and that's natural. It's part of life. But it could be because I'm from the 80s and born in the 80s and have this admiration for the 80s on a certain level that to me it seems like the 80s is far stronger, especially than the 90s. And the 70s. It just seems like the 80s feel special. And it could be events, and it was a big decade with a lot of huge events, and there was a lot of growth in the 80s, and a lot of things changed. But I think, for me personally, and I think everyone's reasoning is going to be different, for me, that love from the 80s is a direct result of the type of person I am. I have a 21-year-old and an 8-year-old. This 21-year-old never played with toys. She was born in 98. The 8-year-old played with toys somewhat when he was very small, but that was gone to some degree by the time he was 6.5, probably. I don't know how old I was when I stopped playing with toys, but I can tell you I was older than I probably should have been. I don't feel that the 21-year-old has the same type of imagination as I do. In any way, I don't feel that that's the way her brain works. I think her brain works beautifully. It just works in a different way. I don't feel that my 8-year-old, who has a great imagination in a lot of ways, that his imagination is the same as my imagination or kids from my era, especially kids from the 80s. I feel like that decade, the toys, the entertainment, everything's more conducive to a kid that was driven more by imagination. And I think that may be one of the factors that makes me miss it. The toys were awesome in the 80s. And I say that as a big kid. The G.I. Joes, the He-Man toys, and even for smaller kids, because a lot of these toys come later for me in life. Like, I didn't get He-Man toys until years and years and years after He-Man toys were out. But, a lot of these runs of these cartoons were fairly short in the 80s as far as the number of episodes made, but they continually stayed on rotation. And we got a lot of leftover from the 70s, and we got, and the 60s, the standard, has always been Scooby-Doo up until probably the mid to late 2000s. Scooby-Doo was kind of the standard. Those old Hanna-Barbera classics were kind of the standard. And a lot of those 80s cartoons, Smurfs and things of that nature, become part of that. I know I've spoke with people, and until really realizing my son is a walking encyclopedia of cartoons and animation, the age of some of these cartoons is ridiculous, how old they are. And a lot of people, though, associate them with the 80s. Unrightfully so, but they still associate them with the 80s. And so, to me, everything in that era screamed imagination. you know, uh, in a different way than growing up in the 50's and not having things and having to be very imaginative to play, in a different way than that. But it seemed like the sky was the limit in the 80's, and we thought in the 80's, I think collectively as a people, that we were growing so substantially and so quick. And it turns out, really, if you just sit back and humble yourself and look at where we've got to, we technologically we have advanced unbelievably far since the 80's to this point. It's easy to be unappreciative and to not recognize the growth, but the growth is most definitely there, and it is definitely impressive. But it's easy to kind of lose sight of that. The 80's also was the height of human interaction. Now, I feel that maybe the late 90's, early 2000's, when we had a mixture of physical interaction and digital interaction, that may have surpassed it in many levels. But on the level of person to person and societal interaction, to me, the 80's may be the heyday. You know, you have telephones becoming a part of teenagers' lives and things of that nature, which it had slowly done so up to the 80's. But you still had teenagers in large groups. You still had to find out where your friends were by where everybody was at. Like if you go by and, it's hard to explain. Like if I call so and so and he's not home, I may call his mom and they're all here, or I may ride by and see everybody's bikes there. Whatever the situation is, however it was, to get together into a large group was much harder back then, because getting in contact with everybody was harder, but it was much more common. And interaction was a big thing. It was a big deal to go to the movies together. It was a huge deal to go to the skating rink together. And in a rural area like I live in, those two things kind of continued on into the 90's. But it was a huge deal to go out to eat together. I'm sure in bigger cities, based on what you see and looking back, especially a lot of documentaries made on the 80's, obviously mall culture was huge, and being together in large groups at the mall, that's not something in the rural area that I lived in that was a possibility, but it was huge. You've got a lot of entertainment also in the 80's that begins to become portable and ownable. Music in regards to records and 8 tracks had been ownable and mildly portable with the 8 track. The 8 track was just very short lived. Coming into the 80's, you get tapes, cassette tapes. That makes music portable, much more portable. You get the ability to record music. That makes it much more personal. Mixtapes become this huge thing in the 80's and become a trademark of young teenage love in the 80's and a trademark of self-expression in the 80's. But also, you take something like a movie, something that up to this point, up till you come into the 80's, you may only see a movie once. And, that's going to the theater and seeing it. You may not be able to afford to see it again, or you may go see something else instead, or a movie may get by you. You may not see it on TV. I don't know when and how the TV schedule started working where movies really started to get shown on TV a lot. But when the VHS is introduced and you're able to bring that movie home, that's a game changer. That makes a really big market for movies. For one, the VHS industry was huge, and it's still my favorite format for a movie. I like the impurities in the picture. I like a movie. I used to rent a movie from a place called Movies and Munches. It was a local video store, and I used to rent an American Ninja movie. These are a series of movies of Michael Dudikoff. He's not in all of them, but there's a scene in one of these movies where they're up on top of a hill, and there's all these ninjas, and they're all different colors. And up to that point, I'd only ever seen a ninja in a black uniform, and here's yellow ninjas and blue ninjas. They're all these. I would watch that so much, and watch that one particular fight scene that's close to there, and watch that one training sequence, the way they moved, and try to replicate that movie from myself and maybe even others. But I have to believe it was just me because the two or three parts that I would watch over and over and over again. And I do this with a lot of martial arts movies, trying to get the move down, trying to recreate the move. That part of the videotape would wear out. And as I grew older, I found out that also happened in movies that had more adult scenes. The adult scenes wore out and started to get grainy looking because they had been rewound and rewatched so many times. But the VHS coming into homes and becoming, such a big part of entertainment and freeing up entertainment. Like the ideal to me, like I said, you're looking 90s actually before I got my first VCR. And I remember one of the first VHSs I ever outright owned, that I remember. I want to say there were some that we were given at school, maybe some educational ones, but the first one I remember owning outright that was mine for my personal collection came from McDonald's. And it was... they were giving away, like as part of a promotional thing, VHS copies of the Indiana Jones movies. And I remember trying to collect all those. That was a big goal for me, was try to get those and try to get the basketballs from Pizza Hut. That giveaway very well may have been in the 90s. Again, the movies obviously had been out for a while for them to give them away on VHS. I'd have to go back and check dates on that. But to me, that... when I was younger, eventually music overtook everything. But up until that point, movies and VHS were so important to me. And I loved movies, and I loved them in the VHS format, and I collected movies. I collected Kung Fu movies, martial arts movies, action movies, any Bruce Lee movie. And it become, such a just driving thing for me. But that all came from the 80s, and that was all new in the 80s, So you look back and you've got really this media revolution in the 80s. In the 80s, you get the 24-hour news cycle starting to form. In the 80s, you get music television. In the 80s, you get home video. In the 80s, you get cassettes that are portable and personalizable. The same thing ends up happening with the VHS and your ability to record and use the VHS in that manner. I would always record, anything I seen on TV that was remotely related to martial arts whatsoever. And martial arts in the 80s was a huge thing. It's not what MMA is now as far as participation, maybe. I don't know. It very well could be this on that same level or even higher. I believe that the fascination, the mystique was there, and the love for it was there for martial arts in the 80s of all kinds. That's where I fell in love with martial arts, was from the 80s. And since then I've trained jiu-jitsu, and I realized gaps in a lot of things that weren't real, that I seen, but it has never diminished my love for martial arts movies and traditional forms of martial arts. And that came from this explosion of that in the 80s. I think that happened in China probably more towards the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and then pushed its way into America and become a really, really big thing in the 80s. TV was huge in the 80s as well. Again, great sitcoms, great comedies, great cartoons. But the movies to me, entertainment-wise, really, you've got so many great comedies. Chevy Chase was in his prime to me in the 80s. You've got National Lampoons. You've got the vacation movies. You've got all these different. I got Beetlejuice in the 80s. I got Batman in the 80s. I got the height to me of Bill Murray. It is coming into early 80s and going out. But you also got these really good, really funny, Revenge of the Nerds, all these B movies. Money Can't Buy Me Love, which was a fairly good movie. What today would be considered maybe, people would scoff at and go, well, that's a rom-com, or that was... I mean, so what? In the 80's, it probably was a rom-com, but it was a great movie. And I wonder often if is that a reflection of the admiration and love of the times, or is that the movies were that much better? You know, was were these movies that far superior? You know, and when I watch something like um, the original version of an 80's movie, then I turn and look at the remake. I often go, yeah, which that's pretty true with a lot of remakes, Um, but 80's movies, I still have seasonal movies. I'm going to do a podcast for each season as they come, but I have seasonal movies. I have movies that I'll watch in the summer, movies that I'll watch around Halloween, and movies that I'll watch around Thanksgiving and Christmas. And most of those movies are 80's movies. I'm going to watch the Ernest movies. I'm going to watch the Chevy Chase movies. I'm going to watch the Bill Murray movies. Um, it's it's just a tradition. It's something that I do, and almost all those movies are based from the 80's. There's some newer ones, but almost all those movies are based from. This is not to say that I think there's no great movies made past the 80's. I think some of the best movies made were made past the 80's, but the entertainment is different. You know, the culture was very different, and the culture is attractive in a lot of ways because it's especially somebody that loves social interaction. The culture was so social, and the culture was so interactive, and the culture was so involved, and people very much had real relationships with people, not these fake relationships. And there was tension. There was the Cold War. I'm obviously way too young to remember that or have any influence from that. But there was things of that nature. There was a drug war. There was a lot of lying going on politically. There was Dare. I think every kid my age remembers Dare, which I assume filtered on into the 90's. But the 80's are just a very nostalgic time, and it seems like the people that love the 80's really love the 80's because it was an easy decade to fall in love with. It was an easy decade to find yourself enamored with. I mean, the 80's were the birth of the WWF, really, and the birth of mainstream wrestling. Wrestling in the 80's was probably only rivaled in popularity by wrestling in the late 90's. And it's amazing looking back at the love I had for something like that. Sports teams, though, in general, you look at sports the same way. You had Magic's Lakers, and you had Birds Celtics, and you had the birth of the Jordan dynasty being created. Or this mythic player coming up, and you had a lot of what would come to be appreciated as some of the greatest players ever, either starting out their career or winding up their career in the 80's as far as basketball went. And sports in general in the 80's become very, very mainstream and popular. But it also, a lot of my heroes, sporting wise, came out of that decade. They may have just started in that decade, but by the end of that decade, they'd become very prominent. Or they were already prominent. I'm a huge Bird fan. I like Magic Johnson. Obviously, I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan. So, that culture was there, and growing. And going back to the wrestling, I mean, look, the reason I'm not going to sit and talk about wrestling all day is because I could sit and talk about wrestling from the 80's all day, and I think that wrestling from the 80's deserves its own retro flashback show. So this won't be the only retro flashback show you get. You'll probably get a lot of those, and I'll probably break down different things from 80's movies, 80's music, 80's wrestling, a lot of different things. But this is kind of an all-encompassing why we love the 80's. Again, you go to something like I think it was VH1 run the I Love the 80s series. There's a reason that that was successful. You know, the 90s and 2000s were successful too, but the I Love the 80s one was really successful. CNN done a spotlight on the 80s. I think they may have done the 90s as well. I don't know. I didn't watch it. But I did watch the 80s one. There is this nostalgia towards the 80s and this love towards the 80s and this longing for the 80s that, deserved or not, is very real and very much there. And it's one of those things that you look at and see in a lot of people that may have been, obviously people who were teenagers in the 80s probably have a tie to it much stronger than what I have, because I definitely have a tie to the late 90s much stronger than probably somebody who was born in the 70s or somebody who was born in the early 90s, or mid 90s. You know, when you're a teenager, that does generally trump most things. And in my case, it's really a tie. Being a teenager was an awesome part of my childhood, and I really, really loved the late 90s for that, because it was the end of my teenage years and kind of the height of that teenage experience. To the contrary, the end of the 80s was a huge, huge part of my life, and I really loved a lot of things about the 80s. Um, it's hard to put into words, you know, how I feel when I see nostalgic things from that time, whether it be toys or TV shows or commercials. You know, cartoons and being young and watching cartoons and having these rituals of watching certain cartoons at certain times or certain shows, you know, watching the A-Team, you know, things of that nature are hard to explain. It's hard to convey the emotions that you feel, but it takes very little to trigger those emotions. Something as simple as seeing a moment of footage or an intro to a show, or you know, something as simple as seeing a toy at a yard sale, or you know, something of that nature, or looking at an old picture. It feels like the perfect time. You know, you ask certain people from a certain demographic about the 50s, and it seemed like the world was perfect. There were other people who didn't have such a great time in the 50s. It's two different views on the same decade. You ask people my age generally about the late 80s, mid to late 80s, and they have this nostalgic, beautiful view. There's going to be people out there that don't share that. There's going to be people out there that feel differently about that decade and that time. But it's a matter of what your experience was and at what point in your life you were in, you know. There's a lot of things that, looking back at the 80s, you know, the way people that I guess were considered, quote, nerds were treated, you know, and really over-sexing. It was the sexualization of so many things, you know. To see things like Hell Comes to Frogtown, the Roddy Piper movie. I believe that was late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And Ski Patrol and all these movies, you know, Police Academy. There's a lot of sexual innuendo and nudity. There was a lot of boobs in the 80s on movies. It's just, it may have been the most boob-heavy decade out there. I believe it was. You can't count the internet porn era, because that's just, everything's out there. But at that time, up to that point, and even lesser into the 90s, I really believe the 80s were super boob heavy. And I don't know, it's just the way it was. But every time I get the chance to watch one of those old movies, I do it. Every time one of those old songs come on the radio, I listen to it. And every time I can get my son to watch one of those old cartoons, I watch it. It was a great time for me in my life, and it was a great time for a lot of people in their life. And I truly miss it, and I truly enjoyed it. But I don't miss it more than I love life now. That's the important part. Nostalgia is good. Memories are good. Cherishing something in your past is good. But you got to focus forward. That way you can appreciate what you've got now. I would love to have a huge 80's party. I think that would, 80's theme party would be so fun. Something I'd like to do with my friends if my friends all hung out together and got out of the house and weren't on social media all the time. I think that would be a blast. But people were a lot more social back then, and they were painted a lot of times in entertainment as being backwards and antisocial. But I think that's the opposite now. People put pictures on social media to show how social they are, and then in real life they're actually very antisocial and very closed off. And I think people were much less closed off and much more socially active in the 80's, and that is something I truly miss. I hope you enjoyed this retrocast. I'm going to do these from time to time on different things. I hope my 80's funk intro didn't scare anybody off when they heard that. It was a quick little throw together on GarageBand, but I thought it befitting this podcast, and I thought it's so befitting this podcast. That's what we're going to play our way out with. Again, thank you for listening, and I'm not going to give you all that junk I usually give you at the end of one. If you want to find me, you know where to find me. If you don't like me, you know how to like me. It's a pretty rad podcast, I think. Speaking of rad, the movie Rads from the 80's. If you've never seen it, go watch it. I got to quit now, or I'll never stop talking about the 80's. You guys have a good night, and bye.